I'm now
Yeah.
recording it.
All right. You got it. All right. Very good. All right. So let's go into our slide deck here, TFA pools. Without running the slide, I'll just do it in this format here. So I did this presentation last fall at the TFA summit, and I did this is kind of an updated version I did just like a month ago when I was in Denver. And I say it's our best kept secret, which is a bit of an inside joke because TFA has not done a good job at publishing compensation, let alone our pools and how you qualify and all of that. And there's a lot to that, but I can tell you I've got serious traction on getting that corrected. In fact, I was on a council call yesterday where we talked about that at length. And so the goal is to have a few things accomplished between or before TFA exchange, which is I think it's in October without looking at the dates, down in Dallas, and to roll all this out in Dallas. And so the goal would be we're working on some client marketing materials that kind of highlight, what we're doing with e-money and Wealthscape and FMAX and kind of our value proposition to clients. We're going to work on a TFA recruiting brochure that talks about kind of our platform and our business model. And then we're going to work on a compensation brochure that has everything from our grid to these pools to the alternative guidelines that a couple of you are going to be taking advantage of here this year. And then just get all those resources updated, make it available, and just have a whole lot more transparency on our platform. And frankly, you guys, the reason we don't have it, there's no real big conspiracy. It's just all these things just take bandwidth and time and resources and energy and compliance and marketing, and there's just a lot to all of those things. And so it's just getting all the horses lined up in information. I think we're starting to get that done. So that said, I think these pools are the most interesting and possibly important part of our company. And so what I want to talk about is what's the purpose of these. So I don't actually like calling them bonuses. I'm trying to get them renamed to compensation pools because I think bonus connotates this idea that like it's something happens that like if you hit certain benchmarks, you get something on extra at the end. And this is really a function of trying to concentrate compensation to the most productive people on our system. And so the way I can kind of give you that idea is this is our grid, and this is where every penny goes. So you take a dollar, you can split it up any way you want, but you got 100 pennies to work with essentially, right? And so, we got 65% that flows into the base shop. You can see the generational overrides on there. And these are largely unchanged for decades. There was a small tweak a number of years ago to bump up first and second generation from 10 to 12 and from 5 to 6. But outside of that, these percentages haven't changed, and I don't anticipate them really ever changing, which is part of the continuity and legacy we've built. But you'll notice at the bottom, 9.5% of every dollar of securities business you write goes to these pools. So all of us pay in 9.5% to the pools, but only SMDs that qualify pull out of the pools. And that's a very important distinction. What that means is if you're not an SMD, so if you're within my base shop, you're not going to qualify to get those pools. But it also means if you're a, CEO, EVC, one of these bigger hierarchy leaders, and you're not really running a base shop, but you have tons of SMDs, you're also not participating in the pools. So these are base shop pools, or at least the ones I'm going to focus on today. So essentially, if you look at that 9.5%, basically every piece of business we write is going to fall into one of two silos. It's either a securities piece of business or it's an advisory piece of business. And of course, I'm talking about TFA business here. I'm not talking about life insurance. So every piece of advisory business in the whole company goes into the advisory base pool. And that might evolve eventually, probably not anytime soon, but that's just because advisory is a much smaller portion of our overall revenue. And so they wanted to get as much dollars into that pool as possible versus spreading it too thin. But of the securities pool, so this is variable annuity, variable life, mutual funds, those would be the big ones. 40% of that money goes into the base pool, 30% goes to the super base, and 30% goes to the super team. So to qualify it, one thing I just said is, if you don't have a base shop, you might be getting some serious pool checks in super base and super team. But the base pool is what we're going to kind of focus on here today. And so, my point to the group, I'm going to run through this, by the way, and then we can come back with questions and refer back to pages. But my point to the group is you guys are all familiar with the 80-20 rule, I believe, which is roughly 20% of people in any organization are going to do 80% of the production. That just seems to be a standard in life. It's just the way the world works. My point to the group is I think there's another 80-20 rule of the 80-20. In other words, the top 20% of the top 20%. So if you do that math, the top 4% of our company are going to do a disproportionate, huge amount of production in this company. It's going to be disproportionately higher quality, less NIGOs. Those are probably the SMDs and base shops that are onboarding the most new reps, submitting the most new business, need the most service. And so we want to really concentrate marginal compensation to the most productive outlets. So here's the first thing to understand. And I'll just, the number doesn't matter. Just think about the percentage. If we took this extra 9.5% and we didn't have these pools, and all we did was we paid that extra 9.5% out to, let's say, SMDs. So just to make the math easy, let's just say SMD paid 75% instead of 65%. It technically would be 74.5. That would not have the same effect as these pools do, because that's going to dilute that revenue to every SMD in the company. And what that means is the SMD like me that's running a 1 million point base shop, bringing a disproportionate huge amount of value to the company relative to my costs, so to speak. I'm not bogging down the phone lines of business review. We don't have tons of NIGOs, all that kind of stuff. I would be, an extra 9.5% would be, I'd be taking a huge pay cut versus what I'm making now. But the SMD that does 2 securities trades a year gets an extra 9.5% on 2 trades. Doesn't move the needle there either. So do you guys understand that concept before I move on, that we're concentrating this money? So if everybody pays in, let's say thousands pay in, but hundreds receive the benefit, those hundreds are cumulatively receiving a much bigger share of what they otherwise would get. Do you guys understand that concept?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So that's the whole idea. So years ago, they developed these tiers, and here's how the tiers work. So let's just stick with advisory first, and then we can talk about securities. But advisory, all the dollars go into the base pool. So everything is based on rolling 12 months. So we're always looking at your most recent 12 months. And once you're an SMB, you've got to have 150,000 TFA base points to get into either pool. So if you have 125,000 advisory points and no securities points, even though you're, over the 100,000 for tier 2 of the advisory pool, you're not going to get a check, because you got to be over 150 to get into either pool. And that was just a mechanism that was put on there. And so the way the current tiers are, I'm saying current because I think they might change, is tier 1, it starts at 50,000 and goes to let's call it 100,000. Tier 2 is 100 to 200. Tier 3 is 200 to 300, and then everything over 300,000 goes into tier 4. So the whole idea of the tiers is to further concentrate compensation to the very most productive SMDs. And so I'll come back and say something on that in a minute, but this is an example. So this would be, in fact, I'm going to bounce down to the advisory pool. So let's say $100,000 goes into the pool in a month, and that's a low number. I think that number is bigger now. It might be 125 or 150, something like that. So essentially, if you take the total revenue of the company, 9.5% of that, on a monthly basis, goes into the pool. Well, each tier gets a 25% allocation. So in this example, $25,000 goes into each tier. Well, based on some reports I ran, 91 SMDs in the company had at least 50,000 advisory points. Now, this isn't screening out how many of those are also over 150 in total. So this isn't an exact number, but it works for a concept. So in this example, 91 people are splitting that $25,000. So you guys can do the math there. You're talking about maybe on average a couple $100 per person, is what each of those people are going to get. So if you're an SMD and you're doing 85,000 advisory points and you have another, 65,000 plus of VA points, let's say, maybe your advisory check at the end of the month is going to be $300. Make something up. Okay. But once you get over 100,000, now only 49 SMDs are dipping into the next year. So now each one of those checks maybe is like $500 or $600 or $700. Okay. And so again, if you're in both tiers, you add the two checks together and maybe your total check. So David Wynn, perfect example, your checks are what, like 800 to 1,000, something like that every month?
Yeah, it's about 4 to 5 times more than what it was in tier one. Yep.
Which is awesome. I mean, and so as you want to keep climbing up, you want to get your butt up into tier 3 because now there's only 16 people split another 20. Another 20. Okay. And by the way, as the company is growing, I mean, this is the ultimate profit sharing compensation plan in the industry. Literally, you're hitching your wagon to the growth of the whole company. And one thing I tell people all the time is, and I say this on stage often. I say, hey, how many people in here would like to override me? And every hand goes up. or I'll pick another leader. How many people want to override James Schwartz or Brian Loiso, and every hand goes up. And I'm like, guess what? You can. And so, for our newest person, so Logan, who's just joining our company, Logan can go and get a business built, get himself established in the next couple of years. And he could get into this profit sharing pool and share revenue of production written by guys that have been here for 30 years. And just why I say this is the most important part of our compensation plan is it's for that example right there. It's what keeps our company relevant. It's what keeps the playing field level. This isn't the kind of deal, dying companies are companies where the opportunity is never as good for new people as it was for the original people. And I'll give you an easy example, like State Farm Insurance. I know some old time general agents just kind of socially and personally. And, if you were a State Farm general agent in the 90s, you are grandfathered into a legacy contract with compensation and benefits and a pension plan and all sorts of things that if you join State Farm today, you're just not getting, right? And there's so many examples of that throughout our industry and the whole world of business. But this is what keeps this kind of fresh and current because as our advisory production grows, as FMAX really takes momentum, and let's say a year or two from now, we've got 200,000 going into the pool every month instead of 100,000. I mean, you guys see what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody that's getting into the pools is going to make more and more money. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
All right. So you can see where this is going. There's currently, as of today, there's 7 of us in tier 4. And so my advisory checks are usually like around, they've been hovering around 18 grand the last like 6 months. Sometimes it's 17 something, sometimes it's 19. It's probably on average 18 grand. And I would tell you that just to make something up, because I don't have the clarity I'd like to see, but I bet like 10,000 of that is my tier 4 check. And I bet like 5,000 of that is my tier 3 check. And then the other 3,000 is probably tier 1 or tier 2, just to make that up off the fly. But you guys get the drift. Like it gets super rich at those upper tiers. Does that make sense?
So that was just referring to your pool check.
You got it. Yeah. So, which, again, think about it, guys. Like my Fidelity check last month was like 27 grand. And of course, that's ramping up quickly. It'll be over 30 next month. But that's not counting the pool. I mean, Fidelity right now is probably worth like, I mean, to make up a number like 45,000 a month to me cash flow. Like if you add the pool revenue in there, I mean, it's absolutely enormous. And and so part of what we're going to be changing in this company is we're building a lot of momentum from all corners of people are. I mean, I even have Bill Mitchell calling me. He called me last night. We talked for an hour about some stuff, and he's seen what's happening on the tiers, and he actually wants to take these tiers and get them over on the WFG side of things because he sees how powerful they are. But I'm telling you guys, there is massive momentum in advisory and securities in general, and I think the idea of like building a life only practice is just going to feel very limited and antiquated 5 years from now. I mean, there'll still be guys around, right? I mean, there's a lot of legacy businesses that are so established. You still see them all over America, but they're not growing. They're not as relevant as they used to be. And I'm telling you, the TFA. I mean, we are literally rebuilding this company from the ground up, year by year here. So these two tiers are a big part of it. If I go back and show you the securities pool, again, I'm using a conceptual number. There's a lot more money going in the securities pool. I mean, to give you a super rough ballpark, I bet advisory is something like 10 or 15% of all TFA revenue. Our biggest revenue source by far is RILA business. I mean, it's almost 2/3 of our revenue as a company, as TFA. And then you'd have probably VUL as the next biggest revenue source, and then you'd have advisory. And so advisory is growing, but it's just growing from a much smaller base. So, the securities pool has a lot more money going into it, but it also has a lot more money or people dipping out of it. And so I'm in tier 4 of securities as well. But I can tell you my average securities checks are like 2,500 to $3,000. And that's not a direct comp because our advisory production as a base is about double what the securities production is. But I can tell you as a percentage basis, which is the easiest way of really figuring out the value. If you take my advisory checks and you basically figure out, okay, what does this pay out effectively as a percentage of my production? It's about 30 to 33% on most months. And if you take the securities checks I get at the top tier, it's about 10%. So in other words, my effective contract as an SMD on advisory is over 90%. If you take the 65 I make on the grid plus the 30, and I'm over 90%, my effective payout on securities is like 75%. Do you guys follow that math?
Yeah. Yes.
I can't see any of your faces because I'm so bad at sharing a screen, but so
yes.
you got to say no. You can't just shake your head.
We are saying it. So I guess if I could ask, I'm on the security side, I'm at maybe like 45 to 48,000 securities points. So once I kind of get over that 50,000 point hump on the security side, my check's going to be kind of pretty small, but I'd at least be part of that tier one pool.
You got it. I'd venture a guess that your check would be like $100 to $200, something like that.
Okay.
And but you would be in the pool, correct?
Yeah. Okay.
And I'd venture a guess that your advisory check would be really in line with David's. I mean, David, you know what your rolling 12 advisory production is, ballpark?
Boy, I would say one.
I mean, I know you're over 100, but I don't.
Well, maybe
I'm sorry, how much?
Maybe 120, 130, maybe.
All right. Yeah. So you might be a bit more.
I'll also be with what I'm working on right now. What's exciting about this is I'll probably be having another 30,000 points added to that within the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Huge. So the thing about it is for Alec and David, so if you're both in tier 2, even if David's production is 150 and Alec, your production is 105, you guys would make the exact same percentage bonus on your business. In other words, if David gets $1,500 on, his check, and Alec, you get $1,100, if you each took your check and multiplied it by 12 to annualize it and divide it into your rolling 12 production, that's how I figured out those percentages. They would be the exact same percentage. So, I can look at the leaders bulletin and look at people's production, and I can take my percentage in tier 4, and I know to the penny what everybody else got in that pool. So I don't know if that you guys follow all that, but it's not also not super relevant. But anyways, so it's a really elegantly designed system, and that's pretty much the gist. And so maybe a final thing to cover here is, I love covering this slide. And so the whole idea here was we wanted to close the gap between kind of what you can get as a personal producer at other firms, while retaining our building model. And so the idea here would be, how could you possibly live on a 90% contract? I jokingly talk about when like LPL recruiters call me, that's what I say to them. And I always get like a funny reaction because, I'd have to take a pay cut to take a 90% contract because, at the base shop I'm running, and by the way, my base shop, our base shop is Securities. We're over $1 million now. And I don't think it's ever going to drop below $1 million, even as I spin Alec out and eventually Brian out, here this year. Their points are going to start rolling out of our base shop, but I'm growing my business and hopefully recruiting new people and developing them. And so, I have no plans on ever like drifting back down to a measly 800,000 or 900,000 point base shop. I say that a little facetiously because that's still a monster base shop in Securities. But the idea would be, you guys, I effectively have like a 90% payout right now on my personal business, if you count the security, the pool checks. But I still have the ability to collect generational overrides. So, let's take Alec. Alec is on the verge of qualifying for his SMD promotion here. The cool part about that is, Alec spins out of my base. So he now gets that 65% contract. So if I go back up to our grid, Alec now goes from 50 to 65. I'm still at 65, but I'm now I now start picking up this 12% first generation override. And then, Alec's production will roll out of my pools, but they'll roll into his pools. And, that's one of the reasons why, I've had conversations with both Alec and Ryan. Like, one thing that's really important is I want to make sure that, when they spin out, that they spin right into those pools. Because if you do the math on, first of all, if you guys do the alternative promotion guidelines, which has been kind of a path for our team, by definition, you're over 100,000 points on your advisory production. You guys are doing annuity and other business as well. So you're, I know Alex knocking on the door of 150. And so I think getting in that pools are critical. So Alex going to go from a 50% contract to effectively a 75% contract, the first month of being an SMD, which, a 50% pay raise on top of, on business that he's already written, is monstrous, on an actual, that's thousands of dollars more income per month to Alex's pocket, which is super exciting. But you guys, I don't want you guys to take that for granted, because the vast majority of SMD promotions in our company, people often take a step back because they went on some sprint to qualify for the guidelines. Some hierarchies do exchange legs, some don't, and that's kind of a separate discussion. But the idea would be, you kind of like, crash and celebrate the promotion, and then you have to get back to work. But if you've written nothing but commissionable business to qualify for that contract, you have a higher contract, but it's a higher contract on starting from zero again, right? And so in the business model that we're building, I think that's super powerful.
So you took the screen away, Tyson. But I had two questions. The pools that are so for securities and advisory, the tiers are based on that individual sleeve. So in other words, security is just based off of your securities rolling 12 number.
Yep.
Okay. And then clarify, how is that 9.5% split since it's going into two pools? I know it's based on company revenue, but is it just
Yeah. So
proportion?
basically, it's 9.5% of your advisory. So 9.5% of your Fidelity production, your Goldman Sachs, your Betterment production right now, that just goes straight into that advisory pool because it's all going straight into so the company sorts that off the top, right? Because all production comes through is because you have to remember TFA as a broker dealer is kind of two entities in one. So there are broker dealers out there that are just broker dealers. They don't do investment advisory. They just
Mhm.
do mutual funds, annuities, registered products. And then there's a whole bunch of RIAs that only do advisory business, don't
Mhm.
do any registered products. We are what's called a hybrid broker dealer, which candidly at this point, the vast majority of broker dealers are hybrids. So we're a registered rep and an RIA, firm in one.
Mhm.
So off the top, every time you get paid, 9.5% of every variable annuity trade, trail commission, you name it, goes into that kind of siphon or that silo. 9.5% of every advisory point you have goes into the advisory silo.
Okay.
So the distinction right now is the securities then gets further split between base, super base, and super team. Right now, the advisory just goes to the base, and I think that's going to continue for a while for a number of reasons. But eventually would probably change. I would tell you guys though that the buffers will probably be increasing. In fact, I'm leading the charge to increase them because that was the original design of not the buffers, the tiers. That was the original design of the plan was because if we don't increase the tiers, then what happens is you end up having dilution. So like if right now there's you know again I took the slide down, but if there's let's say 50 SMDs in the top tier of securities, well 2 years ago that number might have been 30. 2 years from now that number might be 80, right? And so the pool checks are getting really diluted, and so it's a mechanism that encourages reps to build their businesses bigger and bigger, and it's a mechanism the company has to basically raise the stakes to qualify for the same tiers, but it's a win-win. You want the tiers to grow now. Now we're not talking about like massive changes, and I have no idea what they might even be. It's got to run through a committee and be bantered about for months and all sorts of things. And I'm a small part of that process. But my suspicion is, if it were up to me, the first tier would start at 100 versus 50. That was a bit of a compromise when we got that done originally. But to me, I think 50,000 is like such a low number to pay like bonus on. And so if you start both at 100, and then maybe you go 100 to, yeah, I don't know, some higher numbers, but each tier grows by maybe 50,000 points or something. But again, in our model, as you're building recurring income, your production should compound and stack on top of each other. And of course, if you do any commission business or what not on the securities business, that's going to spike you up as well, for that next year. So, I would tell you, consider this like super advanced warning that if the tiers do increase, the soonest they'll increase will be starting in 2027. So you got some time on that. And I think it'll be a modest increase, but I think there is momentum around doing that. And I mean, I was talking to Michelle Berry yesterday, and she's in favor of doing that. So it's just a matter of getting that through all the proper channels. So takeaway, go become an SMD, but don't rest on your laurels. SMD is one milepost on a journey to a much bigger destination. It is by no means a lifetime achievement award, and this is a business where you want to keep growing, keep evolving, and we're gonna pay really well to do that.
It'd be good to circle back on this just from like the prospecting avenue of industry people that would be, worth prospecting to
Well, and
understand.
that's to your point, Ryan. That's why we're trying to get traction on getting a compensation and recruiting brochure that talks about, hey, we are different by design.
Mhm.
And if you think about what's so powerful about those tiers is, let's say you meet somebody that's in the industry, maybe because we're never going to recruit somebody that's got 100 million under management somewhere. That's just not our demographic as an advisor. But maybe you find somebody that is some mid-tier BD, not a lot of support, not a lot of culture, not a lot of training, whatever. Maybe they got 10, 15, 18 million cobbled together. Well, hey, you could bring them in, and as long as they bring those assets over, they would qualify to come in as an SMD. They would immediately be in those tiers, and now we're competitive from a payout standpoint with what they could get in the industry. But they have everything we have. They have Wealth Wave, they have the leadership, they have the culture, they have the system we have. And we take that for granted, guys, because if you go to another company, I mean, you got a rep code and you got like 800 numbers you can call for various field services, just like we do. But you're on your own. Like there's no there's events, but they're like industry like snooze fest conferences where you got a bunch of economists and you know vendors trying to sell you fintech and all sorts of things. But they're not events like we do in Dallas or what we've done for years in Salt Lake, where there's no leadership development, there's no mission, there's no marketing. You're on your own. Come up with your own brand, your own website. It's just a different deal. So we have so much to add to the picture in terms of a recruiting value, proposition. But this compensation piece is obviously a really important part of it. All right, guys, I think we're just up on time. Do you guys feel like you got your arms around this concept?
Much more so now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
David, you're in a long list of people that get bonus checks and don't fully understand how they're calculated or where they're coming from.
I just am grateful to see them, and it was really nice going from tier 1 to tier 2. Yep.
Yeah. Well, look at your production, man. You got a little ways to go, but you're building momentum, and you go get up in that tier 3 check, and you're going to see, you're going to have another, triple of that check. You're going to go from $1,000 checks to $3,000 checks, overnight.
Yeah. I just double checked my number. Yeah, I'm only at 110 right now, so I'm expecting that to be closer to 150 by the end of the summer, and I got to just keep pushing to 200.
You got it.
Yep.
Onward and upward, boys.
Right.
And Lisa.
Yep.
All right, you guys have an awesome week.
You too. Thank you.
Yep.